The morning Kate Collins walked into the sheriff's office in Dusty Creek, Nevada, with a bruised cheekbone and a carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world. She had no intention of falling in love with anyone, least of all the tall, quiet rancher who was leaning against the doorframe trying to look like he wasn't desperate. It was the spring of 1882, and Dusty Creek sat on the edge of the Nevada desert like something the land itself had forgotten to finish building. The main street had 6 buildings worth mentioning: the general store, the saloon, the livery, the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, the telegraph office, and the sheriff's outpost that smelled permanently of boot leather and burnt coffee. Beyond that, the town gave way to flat red earth and scrub brush, and the distant shapes of mountains that never seemed to get any closer no matter how long you rode toward them. Kate had arrived on the morning stage from Reno, and she had nowhere else to go. She was 24 years old, with dark copper hair that refused to stay pinned, green eyes that people either found unsettling or beautiful depending on their constitution, and the particular kind of stillness that comes from having survived things that would have broken someone softer. She had worked 3 years as a seamstress in Reno for a woman named Mrs. Aldridge who paid fair wages and asked no questions, which had suited Kate perfectly because she had answers she preferred not to give. But Mrs. Aldridge had sold the shop and moved east to be with her daughter, and Kate had found herself standing on a Reno street corner with $72 and the uncomfortable freedom of having absolutely no plan. She had taken the first stage that was heading somewhere smaller. Dusty Creek had not been her first choice. It had simply been where the stage stopped. Sheriff Bart Combs, who was 60 years old and had a gray mustache and the patient manner of a man who had seen enough of the world's foolishness to stop being surprised by it, poured her a cup of that burnt coffee and listened to her explain that she was looking for work and a room. He told her that Ruth at the boarding house had a room if she didn't mind the noise from the saloon 2 doors down, and that old Jim Priestley at the general store was looking for someone to help with accounts since his eyesight had started to go. It was while he was telling her this that Henry Easton came through the door. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair that was a little too long, and eyes the color of good whiskey, that particular amber brown that catches the light and holds it. He had the weathered look of a man who spent most of his life outdoors, and the careful, measured way he moved that suggested he was a person who thought before he acted. He was wearing a gray shirt that was clean but had seen better days, and he had his hat in his hands, which Kate noticed immediately because it was a small gesture of respect that not many men bothered with. He stopped when he saw her. Not rudely, just a half-second of stillness, the way a person stops when they encounter something unexpected. "Morning, Bart," he said. "I can come back." "No need," the sheriff said. "This is Miss Collins, just arrived on the stage. Miss Collins, this is Henry Easton." "Has the Easton Ranch about 7 miles east?" Kate nodded. Henry nodded. There was a brief, ordinary moment that neither of them would have been able to point to later as the beginning of anything. Henry had come to the sheriff to ask about a completely different matter, and it was only in the telling of it that Kate Collins became unexpectedly relevant to his problem. The situation, as Henry explained it with the terse efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this conversation on the long ride into town, was this: his ranch was being contested. His neighbor, a man named Gerald Crane, who had come into the territory 3 years ago with Eastern money and expansionist ambitions, had filed a legal challenge claiming that a portion of Henry's eastern pasture land rightfully belonged to him, based on a surveyor's report that Henry was fairly certain had been bought and paid for. The territorial court had agreed to hear the case, and the hearing was set for 8 days from now in the town of Silver Bend, which was a 2-day ride south. That was not the whole of the problem. The whole of the problem was that Gerald Crane's lawyer had submitted documentation that included references to a letter Henry's deceased father had allegedly written, in which the elder Easton had supposedly agreed to sell the eastern pasture to Crane's predecessor. Henry knew no such letter existed. He knew it because his father, James Easton, had loved that eastern pasture more than he loved most things, had built the original fence line himself, and would never have agreed to sell it to anyone, let alone in a private letter that bypassed every legal formality that existed. But there was another complication that Henry reached last, setting his hat on the sheriff's desk and running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was clearly a man reaching the part of the story he found most frustrating. Gerald Crane had been making social calls. Not to Henry. Crane had not spoken to Henry directly in 6 months, preferring to conduct their disagreement through lawyers and surveyors. No, Crane had been making social calls to every influential person in Silver Bend and the surrounding territory, and at every one of those calls, his narrative was the same, that Henry Easton was an unstable young man, barely keeping his ranch afloat, a bachelor with no roots and no reason to hold onto land he clearly could not manage, and that the Crane development operation would bring prosperity to the region in a way that one struggling rancher never could. Henry's lawyer, a good man named Thomas Webb who practiced out of Silver Bend, had written to tell him that in the territorial court, reputation mattered enormously, and that the judge assigned to the case, a man named Judge Harlan Priestley, no relation to the storekeeper, was known to be socially conservative and inclined to favor men of established family standing. Webb had strongly suggested, in language that was diplomatic to the point of near incomprehensibility, that Henry might want to consider whether there was any way to present himself as a more settled, established figure. Henry had spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what that meant in practical terms. And then Webb had written again, more plainly this time, and said that Crane had been telling people Henry was a drifter who happened to inherit land, and that if Henry could demonstrate otherwise, could show that he was a man of community and family, the judge would look more favorably on his character in a case where character was going to matter as much as documentation. "He wants you to show up to the hearing with a wife," Bart Combs said, in the way of a man who had already heard this story once and was now helpfully summarizing it for the newcomer. Henry's jaw tightened slightly. He suggested that a visible family situation would help. "That is what that means, son." Kate had been sitting quietly through all of this, and she had the distinct feeling that the sheriff had chosen not to ask her to leave for a reason he had not yet made clear. She looked at Henry Easton, who was clearly deeply uncomfortable with the entire direction of this conversation, and she looked at the sheriff, who was watching her with the patient expression of a man who is waiting for someone else to connect two obvious things. "I am not going to ask a woman to pretend to be my wife," Henry said, before anyone else could speak, and his voice was flat and final in a way that suggested he had been arguing with himself about this for some time. "It's not right. It's not right that Crane is trying to steal your land with a forged letter either," Bart said. "Sometimes you work with what you have. There has to be another way. There might not be." There was a silence in which the burnt coffee smell was very present and the distant sound of the livery stable drifted in through the open door. Kate set down her cup. "How much does the ranch mean to you?" Henry looked at her. She had the feeling he was reconsidering her, the way a person looks at something again when they realize they did not quite see it the first time. "It's my father's land," he said. "It's the only thing he left me." Kate understood that. She understood it in a way that lived in her chest rather than her head. "And if you lose the hearing," she asked, "the eastern pasture goes to Crane, and if the eastern pasture goes, the water access goes with it. Without the water, I can't graze the western section profitably. Within a year, I lose the whole ranch." "And this Judge Priestley," Kate said, "he genuinely cares that much about whether a man is married?" "Tom Webb says the judge's own wife died 2 years ago, and he has become very particular about family values since then," Bart offered, "which is the kind of irony that the West seems to specialize in." Kate looked at her carpet bag. She looked at the $72 she had in the pocket of her traveling coat. She looked at the room and board situation that was waiting for her at Ruth's boarding house, and the accounting job at the general store. And she thought about what her life was going to look like in this small town in the Nevada desert if she started it the way she was currently starting it. Then she looked at Henry Easton, who was clearly a man in genuine trouble, who was clearly not comfortable asking for help, and who had just said it's the only thing he left me in a tone of voice that she recognized from the inside. 1 week, she said. Both men looked at her. I'll go to Silver Bend with you. I'll attend the hearing and whatever social occasions need attending before it. 1 week. After that, we come back here and we go our separate ways. She paused. I'll need the room at the boarding house paid for 2 months in advance when we return, and an introduction to Jim Priestley so I can apply for the accounting position with a reference from the sheriff. Henry stared at her with an expression that was not quite suspicious and not quite grateful and was somehow both at once. You don't know me, he said. I don't know anyone in this town, Kate said. That's not a reason to do nothing. Bart Combs made a sound that was either approval or the beginning of a cough and was probably both. Henry picked up his hat from the desk and turned it in his hands twice. I would pay you, he said quietly. It would only be right. Room and board covered for 2 months is payment enough, Kate said, and I would want to be clear on the terms. 1 week. We maintain whatever we need to maintain in public, and in private we keep a respectful distance. I don't need complications, and I suspect you don't either. Agreed, Henry said. They shook hands on it. They're in Bart Combs's office with the burnt coffee and the Nevada light coming through the dusty window, and it was the most businesslike thing Kate had ever done. And somehow even then, in that very first moment of agreement, something small and inconvenient shifted in the air between them, and neither of them looked directly at it. They left for Silver Bend the following morning. Henry had a wagon, which was more practical than horses for the supplies and Kate's carpet bag, and the road south wound through high desert country that was starkly, almost aggressively beautiful in a way that Kate, who had grown up in Missouri before life had moved her westward, was still learning to appreciate. The red earth and the pale sky and the occasional dark shape of a hawk riding the thermals overhead. It was not the lush green country of her childhood, but there was something honest about its dryness, something that did not pretend to be other than what it was. They did not talk very much on the first day, which suited them both. Henry drove the wagon with the focused ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and Kate sat beside him and watched the landscape and thought about what she was doing, and decided not to think about it too carefully because it would not help. Occasionally, he would say something about the country they were passing through, the name of a rock formation, a note about where a spring was hidden that looked dry from the road, a comment about a herd of wild horses he had spotted there once and never seen again. He said these things in a quiet, offering sort of way, not filling silence for the sake of it but making small gifts of information, and Kate found herself unexpectedly grateful for it. Around noon, they stopped beside a dry creek bed where a cottonwood tree had somehow found enough water underground to grow large and offer shade, and Henry unpacked a lunch that Kate had not expected: cornbread and salt pork and dried apple slices and 2 pieces of something that turned out to be molasses candy wrapped in paper. My housekeeper made the cornbread, he said, passing her a piece. Martha. She's been at the ranch since before I was born. She's the one who told me the candy was non-negotiable for long journeys. She sounds like a sensible woman, Kate said. She is. He was quiet for a moment. She knows what we're doing. I didn't want to hide it from her. She agreed it was the right thing to try, and she didn't say anything else about it. Kate noted the care with which he had told her this. He had been honest with the people in his household. He had not wanted her to think he was involving her in a deception that went deeper than it needed to. What should I know? Kate asked. For the hearing, for the social occasions. What story should I tell? Henry looked at the cottonwood tree for a moment, working something out. Tom Webb suggested we say we married quickly on account of circumstances, that we've been corresponding for some time, and that when the right moment came, we didn't see the point in waiting. People don't examine that story too closely. Where am I from in this story? Where are you actually from? Missouri originally, more recently Reno. Missouri is fine. It's easy to be truthful about the things that don't matter. Kate looked at him sideways. That's a perceptive thing to say. He seemed briefly self-conscious. I read a lot. There's not always company at a ranch in the evenings. She thought about that, this man alone in a ranch house with the Nevada dark outside and a book open in the lamplight, and something in her chest made a small movement that she firmly ignored. Tell me about the ranch, she said. If I'm going to speak about it convincingly, I should know it, he told her. And once he began talking about the ranch, the careful, measured quality of his speech loosened somewhat, the way a river loosens when the channel widens. He told her about the main house that his father had built in 1863, that had started as 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, and had been expanded over the years until it had 5 rooms and a proper front porch with a good view of the mountains. He told her about the cattle, 340 head, mostly shorthorns with some longhorn crosses, and about the eastern pasture that was the center of all this trouble, how it sat in a natural bowl that caught the winter snowmelt and fed a small creek that ran 8 months of the year, which in Nevada was as close to paradise as land could get. He told her about his father, James Easton, who had come to the territory in 1858 from Ohio with $20 and a belief in the particular westward American logic that a man could make something from nothing if he was willing to work without stopping. He did, Henry said simply. He made something from nothing, and then he died of fever 3 years ago and left it to me, and I have spent 3 years trying to be worthy of it. Kate heard all of this and did not say anything immediately, because some things deserve a moment before they are answered. My father left me nothing, she said finally. He died when I was 9. My mother raised 3 of us on washing and mending until she could not any more, and then I raised my 2 younger brothers on the same until they were old enough to make their own way. She paused. I know what it is to have something be entirely yours and to not want to lose it. Henry looked at her then, a real look, the kind that sees rather than merely observes, and she held it for a moment before turning back to the road. They reached Silver Bend late on the 2nd afternoon, the town materializing out of the scrub brush with the abruptness typical of western settlements, as if someone had simply set it down in the middle of the desert and forgotten to explain why. It was larger than Dusty Creek, with a proper main street and 2 hotels and a newspaper office and a bank and more activity than Kate had seen since leaving Reno. The courthouse was the nicest building in town, which said something about local priorities that Kate found either reassuring or concerning, depending on how you looked at it. Tom Webb was waiting for them at the better of the 2 hotels, a man in his 50s with a lawyer's careful hands, and a kind face that was currently arranged in the expression of someone trying to be encouraging despite everything. He shook Henry's hand and then turned to Kate with the careful courtesy of a man who was simultaneously grateful for her presence and slightly appalled by the situation that had created it. Mrs. Easton, he said, testing the words. Mr. Webb, Kate said without flinching. He relaxed slightly. Good, good. The hearing is in 5 days. In the meantime, there are 3 social events that will matter. The Tuesday supper at Judge Priestley's home, to which both parties in the case and their families have been invited. That was the judge's doing. He believes in knowing who he is judging the Wednesday Merchant Association dinner, which Crane will certainly attend with his wife, and where you will need to be visible, and Thursday's church social, which is not optional in a town where the minister and the judge play chess together every Friday morning. Kate absorbed this systematically, the way she absorbed most things. Understood. Is there anything particular about Judge Priestley that I should know before Tuesday? Webb looked at her with something that was close to relief. He lost his wife to typhoid in 1880. He has a daughter named Clara who is 15 and who lives with him. He is a serious man but not an unkind one, and he genuinely cares about the law. The problem is that he has also begun to care about something more intangible, about what he calls the moral fiber of the territory, and Crane's lawyer has been very deliberately targeting that. What specifically has Crane's lawyer been saying? Henry asked. His voice was level, but there was an edge beneath it. That you are not a man of roots, that the ranch is a burden you inherited rather than a home you chose. That a man who at 30 has no family and no attachment to his community is not the kind of man the territory should be protecting its land for. Webb paused. It is extremely unfair and also unfortunately effective with this particular judge. Then we will address it, Kate said. She felt Henry look at her and she kept her attention on Webb. We will address all of it. Their rooms were adjacent, with a shared wall and a door between them that stayed firmly locked from both sides, which was as it should be, and which both of them treated with the utter matter-of-factness of two people who were being professional about an unusual situation. On the first evening in Silver Bend, Kate sat at the small writing desk in her room and took stock of what she had with her to wear. She had two dresses that were presentable, one that was more than presentable, and her good wool coat. She was not wealthy, but she had always been good with a needle, and the dresses she owned she had made and maintained herself, and they were well cut and clean and would not embarrass anyone. There was a knock at the door between the rooms, and she said, "Come in," and Henry opened it and stood in the doorway in the way of someone who wants to be respectful of boundaries and is very aware of them. "I thought we should rehearse a little," he said. "Things we would know about each other, if the judge or anyone asks." Kate set down her needle. "Sit down, then." He sat in the chair by the window, and she sat on the edge of the bed, the only other seating available, and they spent the next hour building a shared history out of truthful pieces and careful inventions. They decided that they had begun corresponding 8 months ago, after Henry had placed an advertisement in a Reno newspaper seeking a wife, which had the advantage of being a practice common enough in 1882 that no one would question it. They decided that Kate had answered the advertisement because she had wanted a life with more stability than she had in Reno, which was true in every meaningful sense. They decided that Henry had visited Reno twice, and that they had spent 3 weeks total in each other's company before deciding to marry, which was not so short as to seem reckless and not so long as to require too many invented details. They learned each other's preferences. Kate took her coffee with sugar if it was available and without if it was not. Henry did not drink coffee at all, preferred tea, which he grew up drinking because his mother had been from Massachusetts and considered coffee barbaric. Kate's favorite color was a particular shade of blue-green she had seen once in a piece of silk fabric that she had never been able to afford. Henry had never thought about having a favorite color and chose brown, because it was the color of the ranch land in October when the grass went dry and gold, and Kate said that was not really brown, and he considered it and said maybe it was more of an amber, and she said yes, that sounded more like it. These were small things. But small things have a way of accumulating. When Henry got up to go back to his room, he stopped in the doorway and said, "Thank you for this, Miss Collins. I mean that. I know it's a strange thing to be thanking someone for." "Kate," she said, "if I'm going to be Mrs. Easton in public, you should probably call me by my first name in private too, or it will be confusing." "Kate," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, just her name, simply testing it, that settled somewhere in her chest with a weight she tried to pretend she did not notice. "Good night, Henry," she said. "Good night, Kate." He closed the door, and she sat in the lamplight and was very still for a while, and firmly told herself that this was a professional arrangement, and she was a practical woman, and none of these feelings were relevant or welcome. The Tuesday supper at Judge Priestley's house was the first real test. The judge lived in a house on the north end of Silver Bend that was large by local standards, white painted, with a garden that his late wife had planted, and that his daughter Clara was clearly trying to maintain with more determination than expertise. Clara herself opened the door for them, 15 years old, with her father's serious eyes, and a curiosity that she was trying to suppress into appropriate behavior and mostly failing, and said that her father was in the parlor and that dinner would be in an hour. Gerald Crane and his wife were already there when Henry and Kate arrived. Crane was 50, heavyset, with the polished manner of a man who had made his money in Eastern business, and was very aware that money talked loudest when it was presented well. His wife, Millicent, was thin and carefully dressed, and had the particular social smile of a woman who had attended many dinners like this one, and knew exactly what was being assessed at all of them. She looked at Kate with the quick, comprehensive evaluation of one woman taking the measure of another, and Kate held her gaze pleasantly and did not perform anything. Judge Priestley was not what Kate had expected. She had imagined someone severe and perhaps pompous, and instead found a man of 60 who had clearly once been tall and commanding, and was now simply tired, in the way of someone who has lost a great deal, and is carrying the loss with dignity that costs him something every day. He welcomed them with genuine warmth, shook Henry's hand firmly, and turned to Kate with the careful courtesy of a widower who is still recalibrating his sense of what to do with women in social situations. "Mrs. Easton," he said, "I am glad Henry has brought you. I believe these proceedings go better when we know who is involved as whole people." "I appreciate that, Your Honor," Kate said. "I confess I find it somewhat unusual for a judge to host supper for both sides of a case." He smiled, and she could see why he had been a good judge for a long time. "I find it prevents certain kinds of theater in the courtroom. When men have broken bread together, they argue with fewer embellishments." Dinner was roast beef and potatoes, and preserved green beans from Clara's garden and biscuits that Clara had clearly made herself with better results than she was expecting, and Kate said so, and Clara flushed with pleasure that she tried to hide, and Judge Priestley looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who was grateful to see her smile. Henry, Kate noticed, was good at this. Better than she would have expected. He spoke directly and without affectation, answered questions about the ranch with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his subject well, and when Crane made a remark about the burden of managing large landholdings alone, Henry said mildly that he did not find the ranch a burden but a purpose, and the table went quiet for a moment in which everyone heard what had been said and what had been replied to. Kate talked about Dusty Creek, where she was technically living and could describe accurately, and about the ride south and the beauty of the country, and she said that after Reno, she found the desert honest in a way that appealed to her, and Judge Priestley said that was exactly the word he would use, honest, and they had a small exchange about what made landscape honest that was entirely natural and not performed at all. And across the table she felt Henry's attention on her, with the quality of someone who is being surprised. After dinner, while Crane and Henry and the judge drank whiskey and talked about the legal particulars in the guarded, careful way of men who know they are both on record, Millicent Crane sat with Kate in the parlor and was direct in the way that women are direct when they dispense with social pretense because they are curious enough to bother. "You married him quickly," Millicent said. "It was not a question." "We did," Kate said. "How long had you known him?" "Long enough to know what mattered and short enough to still be learning everything else." Millicent looked at her with something that was almost respect. "Gerald says Henry Easton is a stubborn man who refuses to see when he's beaten." "Perhaps he refuses to see it because he isn't beaten," Kate said pleasantly. Millicent's smile had something complicated in it. "You might be right," she said, and changed the subject, and Kate understood that they had just had a conversation that was about something else entirely and that both of them knew it. On the walk back to the hotel, the night air cool and smelling of dust and sage, Henry was quiet for a long time. "You were remarkable tonight," he said finally. "I was honest about the things I could be honest about," Kate said. "It's easier than inventing things. The judge likes you." "The judge is a lonely man who misses his wife," Kate said gently. I reminded him of what it is to have a woman at the table who engages with ideas rather than avoiding them. That is not a remarkable quality." "I think it is," Henry said quietly, and she did not have an answer for that. They walked the rest of the way in silence that was not uncomfortable, that was in fact very comfortable, which was something Kate decided also not to think about carefully. The Wednesday dinner was louder and more crowded, and more obviously a performance space. The kind of event where Silver Bend's civic-minded citizens came to see and be seen and assess each other's situations. And Kate was aware from the moment they walked in that people knew about the case, and were watching with the particular interest that small communities bring to disputes that involve land and money, and the question of what kind of town they want to be. Henry introduced her to a dozen people in the first half hour, and she shook hands and smiled and talked and listened, and she noticed that people responded to Henry differently with her beside him. Not because she was impressive on her own, or not only because of that, but because his posture changed slightly, became easier, as if having someone beside him removed a tension he had been carrying for so long he'd stopped noticing it. He guided her through crowds with a hand at the small of her back, the conventional gesture of an escorting husband. And the first time he did it, the touch surprised her with its warmth through the fabric of her dress, and she kept her face perfectly composed and told herself again that she was a practical woman. Gerald Crane gave a speech about development and progress and the prosperity that investment brought to frontier territories, and it was a good speech, well delivered, and Kate could see it landing on some of the faces in the room. When people drifted to Henry afterward to say something sympathetic about his case, she noticed they were also watching her, checking her reaction, taking a measure of the Easton situation that included her. She talked to a dry goods merchant who had known Henry's father, who told her that James Easton had been one of the most decent men in the territory, and that it was a shame what was happening. And she said she agreed, and said it with a warmth that was completely genuine because she had come to feel it genuinely. A woman named Dorothy Haynes, whose husband was on the town council, drew Kate aside near the refreshment table and asked, with the careful indirection of someone gathering intelligence, how long Kate had been in Nevada and whether she planned to stay. "I plan to stay," Kate said. "The ranch needs tending, and I am not a woman who leaves things unfinished." Dorothy Haynes nodded approvingly and moved on, and Kate understood that she had just passed a test she had not known she was taking, and that it would be reported accurately to the appropriate people. On Thursday morning, Kate woke early and went down to the hotel dining room before Henry was up, and she sat with coffee and Tom Webb, who had been coming and going from the hotel with the anxious busyness of a lawyer who had a big case in 2 days and was running every scenario in his head. "How do you think it's going?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. "Better than I expected. The forged letter is the crux of it. If I can demonstrate to the judge's satisfaction that it is a forgery, Henry wins on the merits. But if the judge is uncertain, if the letter's authenticity remains in doubt, then character becomes a tiebreaker." He looked at her carefully. "You have helped considerably with the character question." Kate looked at her coffee. "He should win because the letter is a forgery, and he should not lose his father's land to a man with Eastern money and no real stake in the territory. The rest of it should not be necessary." "You're right," Webb said. And yet, Kate agreed. The Thursday church social was held in the churchyard in the afternoon, with lemonade and pie, and the kind of social ease that a shared religious affiliation and mild weather can create even among people who have reasons to be in tension. Kate stood beside Henry while he talked with ranchers and townspeople, and she found herself genuinely interested in the people she met. A Mexican family named the Garcias who had been in the territory before it was Nevada, before it was American territory at all, who spoke to Henry with the warmth of old neighbors, and to Kate with a careful welcome that became warmer when she responded to the children in the few words of Spanish she had learned in Reno. An older black man named Samuel Turner, who had homesteaded 40 miles west, and told Henry plainly that he was watching this case closely, because if Eastern money could take land from a family that had earned it, none of them were safe, and Henry said he understood, and they shook hands with the gravity of men who understand each other's stakes. Kate noticed the way the territory was layered, the families who had been here longest, and the families who had come in the last decade, and the money that was now arriving from the East, and the questions all of this raised about who the West was actually for. She had come from Missouri and then from Reno, and she carried her own history of having no permanent ground, and she understood these questions from the inside. She was standing by the lemonade table thinking about all of this when Clara Priestley appeared beside her with a glass and an expression of barely suppressed curiosity. "You're not what I expected," Clara said, with the direct honesty of 15-year-old girls who have not yet learned that honesty requires packaging. "What did you expect?" Kate asked. "Someone quieter. When my father told me about the case and about Mr. Easton's wife coming, I thought someone would come who just smiled a lot and agreed with things." Kate considered this. "I can smile and agree when it's called for, but it's not my natural tendency." "Mine either," Clara said with feeling. She looked at Kate with the searching look of a young woman who has had insufficient role models for what a woman could actually be. "Do you like living on a ranch?" Kate looked at Henry, who was 20 feet away talking to Samuel Turner with the ease of genuine respect, gesturing once to the east to describe something about the land. The afternoon light was turning golden, and it caught his face and made him look like something out of a landscape painting. And she felt that small, inconvenient thing in her chest again, larger this time. "I think I would," she said honestly. "I have not spent much time there yet." That evening, the night before the hearing, Henry knocked on the shared door and Kate let him in, and he sat in the chair by the window and said nothing for a while, and she waited because she had learned in 3 days that he was a man who arrived at things in his own time and that the waiting was worth it. "I want to tell you something," he said finally. "All right. I know this was a business arrangement. I want you to know I've been aware of that I haven't tried to make it something else without asking." Kate looked at him steadily. "I've noticed that. I appreciate it. But I also want to say that," he started again. "I have not had easy company in a long time, since my father died. Martha is there and she's family in every sense that matters, but she's 40 years older than me and there are things you need, someone your own age, someone to talk to in the evenings. And this week he put both hands on his knees in a small gesture of physical emphasis. "I have talked to you more honestly than I have talked to anyone in 3 years." Kate felt the truth of this land in her like something she had been waiting for. "So have I," she said quietly. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was entirely unguarded, the way a landscape looks when the cloud moves off and the light comes through and everything is briefly very clear. "The week ends on Saturday," he said. "After the hearing." "Yes," Kate said. Neither of them said anything else, but both of them were aware, in that lamplit room with the Nevada night outside the window, that they were approaching the edge of something, and that neither of them knew what was on the other side. The hearing was on Friday morning. The Silver Bend courthouse held about 30 people in its public gallery, and it was full. Kate sat in the front row with Tom Webb's assistant, a young man named Davis who had been assigned to sit with her, and she watched Henry take his seat at the plaintiff's table with a stillness and composure that she recognized as the product of considerable effort. The judge entered and the room stood, and Kate looked at Judge Priestley in his judicial capacity and was struck by the difference from the man at the dinner table. This was a man who had put on authority like a garment, who had made himself into a function rather than a person for the purposes of this room, and who wore it with the particular dignity of someone who understood what it meant. Gerald Crane's lawyer was a man named Aldous Pratt, from Carson City, who was very good at his job and knew it, and who began by presenting the letter in question, allegedly written by James Easton in 1875, allegedly agreeing to sell the eastern pasture to one Theodore Slade, whose land rights Crane now claimed to have purchased. Tom Webb began his response by calling Henry, who testified about his father's attachment to the eastern pasture with a simplicity and precision that was more effective than any emotion would have been. He described the fence line his father had built, the way his father had talked about the creek, a specific conversation from 1878 in which his father had refused a legitimate and well-priced offer for the eastern pasture from a neighboring rancher, saying the land was not for sale at any price. Then Webb called his expert witness, a man from Reno named Charles Follett who had spent 20 years as a documents examiner and who testified, with the methodical certainty of his profession, that the paper on which the Slade letter was written had been manufactured no earlier than 1878, based on its composition and the watermark of the mill that produced it, 3 years after the letter was allegedly written. The courtroom stirred. Pratt challenged this, and Follett held his ground, and for an hour the hearing became a technical debate about paper chemistry and mill records and the specific characteristics of pre- and post-1878 paper stock, and Kate sat in the gallery and watched Judge Priestley's face throughout it, watching the judge evaluate and weigh and arrive at his conclusions with the careful patience of a man who takes his responsibility seriously. When it was over, when Pratt had exhausted his challenges and Webb had made his final argument, and the courtroom had gone quiet, Judge Priestley sat very still for a long moment. He ruled from the bench, which was unusual, and which said something about how clearly he had seen the matter. The letter was not authenticated. The land remained with Henry Easton. The eastern pasture and its water access were confirmed as Easton property. Crane's claim was dismissed. The gallery erupted in the restrained but genuine way of a room full of people who have been watching something important and are relieved by how it resolved, and Kate exhaled a breath she had been holding for what felt like the entire week, and across the courtroom she met Henry's eyes and saw something in his face that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Relief, yes. Gratitude, yes. But also something else, something that was looking directly at her with a specificity that had nothing to do with the verdict. Tom Webb found her in the corridor afterward and shook her hand with genuine feeling. I believe the character evidence helped, though honestly the paper chemistry would have won it in any case. But you handled the week with remarkable. He paused, searching for the right word, grace. Thank you, Kate said. Will Crane appeal? He might try. But the documentation evidence is solid, and the appeal courts are in no hurry. And I suspect Crane will find other territories to develop once this one turns difficult. Webb looked at her with the knowing expression of a man who has been an observer of human beings for a long time. What are your plans, if you don't mind my asking? Back to Dusty Creek, Kate said. I have a room and an accounting position waiting. Yes, Webb said, and his tone suggested that he was not entirely convinced this was the whole of her plans, but he was too polite to press the point. They had dinner that evening to celebrate Henry, Kate, Webb, and Webb's young assistant Davis at the Better Restaurant in Silver Bend, and Henry was lighter than she had seen him all week, some tension fully released from his shoulders, and he laughed twice at things Davis said, and the laugh was easy and genuine, and Kate found it completely disarming and had to look away. After dinner, walking back to the hotel, Henry said, "The week ends tomorrow." "I know," Kate said. "We head back to Dusty Creek in the morning." "I know." They were walking along the main street of Silver Bend in the cool evening, and the stars over the Nevada desert were extraordinary, the kind of star display that cities eliminated and that the plain sky made possible, and Kate was looking up at them partly because they were genuinely remarkable and partly because she needed somewhere to look that was not Henry Easton's face. "Kate," he said. She looked at him. He stopped walking. She stopped walking too, and they were standing in the middle of the street with the stars overhead and the light from the hotel windows 40 feet ahead, and he was looking at her with the same unguarded expression she had seen the night before. "I don't want this to be the end of the arrangement," he said. Kate was very still. "I'm not," he stopped, tried again. "I'm not asking you to continue the pretense. I'm asking something different. I'm asking if you might another stop. He was a man more comfortable with actions than words, and she could see him working to build a sentence that was adequate to what he meant. If you might consider whether the thing that started as a pretense could become something real, over time, without pressure. Just the possibility. Kate looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Missouri and Reno and $72 in her pocket and a carpet bag with everything she owned. She thought about the accounting job at Jim Priestley's general store and the room at Ruth's boarding house and the life she had been building toward step by careful step. She thought about the dinner at the judge's house and Clara Priestley asking her if she liked living on a ranch, and about Samuel Turner saying none of them were safe if Eastern money could take what families had earned, and about Henry's voice saying it's the only thing he left me. She thought about a man who read books alone in the evenings because there was no one to talk to, and who had talked to her more honestly than he had talked to anyone in 3 years, and she thought about how that was exactly what it had been for her too. "I might," she said. His breath released in a way that told her he had been genuinely afraid she would say no. "I want to be clear that it would be honest," she said. "Whatever it becomes, it would need to be honest. I have had enough of things that looked one way and were another." "So have I," he said quietly. "And slow," she said. "I am a practical woman and I do not make significant decisions quickly." "I have a ranch that is going nowhere," he said. "I have time." Kate looked at him one more moment, and then she said very simply, "All right." They stood there in the street another moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then they walked the rest of the way to the hotel side by side, and neither of them mentioned the week, or that it was ending, again that night. They left Silver Bend the next morning as the sun was still low, the wagon packed and the horses rested, and the drive north had a different quality than the drive south had, less careful, more settled, the way a relationship has different qualities in different directions. They talked more freely now. Kate told him more about Missouri, about the green country and the river, and her 2 brothers, William and Daniel, who were both now in Kansas, William farming and Daniel working for a railroad company, both of them doing reasonably well. Henry told her about growing up on the Nevada ranch, about riding out with his father to check the fence lines, about learning everything there was to know about cattle and land and water rights before he was 15, about the particular loneliness of being the only child on 1,000 acres. Around midday, somewhere in the high desert with the mountains visible to the east, he said, "I would like to show you the ranch, the real thing. Not something to support a story, just the land, if you wanted to see it." "I would like that," Kate said. He turned the wagon east instead of continuing straight north to Dusty Creek, and about an hour later she saw the Easton Ranch for the first time. It was more beautiful than she had expected, and she had adjusted her expectations upward based on the way he talked about it. The house sat on a small rise with the mountains to the east and the flat land to the west, and it had the compact, solid look of something that had been built to last rather than built to impress. The front porch was exactly as he had described it. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall that was just beginning to show spring growth. There were cattle visible in the western pasture, small dark shapes against the pale grass, and in the distance she could see where the land dipped down into the bowl of the eastern pasture. Martha came out onto the porch before the wagon had fully stopped, a woman of 65 with white hair and a sharp face, and eyes that saw everything, wearing an apron that had been washed so many times it had gone from blue to the color of pale sky. She looked at Kate with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who has been protecting this household for a long time and was deciding whether Kate was a threat or a blessing. "So this is Miss Collins," Martha said. "Kate," Henry said. "Martha, this is Kate. We won the hearing." "I know you won the hearing," Martha said. "I had every confidence. Come inside, both of you. There is coffee and I made pie." Inside the house was exactly what Kate had imagined and better than she had imagined. It was a lived-in house, which is different from a merely occupied house. There were books on the shelf in the sitting room, real ones, a good collection, and a pipe on the mantelpiece that had belonged to Henry's father and had not been moved, and a rag rug on the floor that Martha had probably made, and that had been walked on enough to have personality. There was a framed photograph on the wall of a man who was clearly Henry's father, the same build, the same quiet in the face, taken sometime in the 1870s in the stiff, formal way of photographs from that period. Kate stood looking at it while Martha poured coffee and Henry was somewhere else. "He was a good man," Martha said from behind her. "James Easton. I came here in 1860 when Henry wasn't even born yet, started as a cook, ended up as whatever you call it when someone is part of the family but doesn't share the name." She paused. "Henry is a good man too. Different from his father, more contained, holds things in more, but good. The kind of good that's quieter than people notice." Kate turned to look at her. "You don't have to recommend him to me, Martha." Martha's sharp eyes softened just slightly. "I know I don't. I can see you already see him." She handed Kate the coffee. "I'm recommending this house. I'm recommending the life here. It is not easy country, and it is not an easy life, and it is worth every bit of it if you want something real." Kate held the coffee cup in both hands and looked out the kitchen window at the mountain view, and thought that there was very little in her life that had ever felt like something she was walking toward instead of away from, and that standing here in this kitchen with the mountains in the window felt like that. Henry came back in and they had pie apple, and it was excellent, and Martha talked at them about what had gone on at the ranch during the week they had been gone. A fence post down on the north side, a calf that had been born early and was doing well, a letter that had come from the Nevada Land Registry in Henry's absence, and that turned out to be a routine survey notification and nothing alarming. When Kate finally said she should get to Dusty Creek before dark to get her room at the boarding house arranged, there was a brief silence that had the quality of a pause before a question. "You could stay the night here," Henry said. "Martha's there. There's a room. It would save the drive and you could start in the morning," Martha said, with the smooth casualness of a woman who had been thinking about this for some time. "The guest room is made up, has been." Kate looked between the two of them and understood that Martha had made up the guest room at some point during the week with a quiet faith in outcomes, and found this both presumptuous and entirely endearing. "All right," she said. "One night." She stayed 2 nights. On the first evening they sat on the porch after supper and watched the sun go down over the western plain, and the colors were extraordinary orange and rose, and a deep purple that built at the horizon and spread upward into blue, and Kate said quietly that she had never seen anything quite like it, and Henry said he had been watching that view his whole life, and he never had either. On the second morning, Henry took her east to the eastern pasture, the one that had been at the center of everything, and she understood immediately why his father had loved it. The bowl shape of the land held the morning light differently from the surrounding country, softer somehow, and the small creek ran clear and quick through the bottom of it, and there were cottonwood trees along the water, and the grass was longer and greener than anywhere else on the ranch. It felt, Kate thought, like a secret the land was keeping. "This is what you almost lost," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood at the edge of the pasture for a while, and the cattle moved in the middle distance, and the creek sound was quiet and constant, and Kate understood in a way that went past logic why this mattered, why it had been worth a week's worth of pretense, and a road trip to Silver Bend, and a judge's supper, and all the rest of it. On the second evening before she left, Henry walked her out to the wagon and then turned to face her with the look of a man who has been composing a sentence for 24 hours. "I know you said slow," he said, "and I meant what I said about that, but I want to ask if I can come to Dusty Creek to call on you in the proper way." Kate looked at this man who had shown her his father's land and his father's photograph and his father's pipe on the mantelpiece, who had talked to her honestly and held every door open, and said it's the only thing he left me with that voice, who had made her feel more welcome in 3 days than she had felt in most of the years she could remember. "Yes," she said, "you can come to Dusty Creek." The smile that crossed his face was brief but comprehensive, and she stored it away in the same place she had been storing all the other things she was pretending not to notice. She drove herself to Dusty Creek in the late afternoon and arrived as the sun was setting over the western desert, and it looked entirely different from the way it had looked when she arrived from Reno less than 2 weeks ago. The same 6 buildings, the same red dust, the same burnt coffee smell from the sheriff's office. But now she knew the names of the streets and the sounds the livery made at night, and the way the saloon's piano went at around 8 o'clock every evening. She paid Ruth for 2 months of the room in advance with the money Henry had given her before she left. He had insisted, saying a deal was a deal, and she had accepted because she had learned that Henry Easton was not a man who made gestures in order to be argued with. And then she went to the general store and introduced herself to old Jim Priestley, who was in fact a distant cousin of the judge, who hired her for the accounting position on the spot, and then said that Bart had spoken highly of her. And she thought that Bart Combs was a man who arranged things quietly and deserved more credit than he received. The weeks that followed had a quality Kate had not expected, ordinary and full simultaneously, the way good things are. She worked at the general store in the mornings, untangling Jim Priestley's books with the systematic pleasure of someone who finds order genuinely satisfying, and she discovered she was good at it in a way that went beyond simple arithmetic, good at seeing patterns in accounts, at identifying waste and opportunity, at the broader logic of a small business operating in a frontier economy. Jim Priestley noticed this and gave her more responsibility, and she handled it and asked for appropriate additional pay, which he gave her without argument, and she found this arrangement deeply satisfying. Henry came to Dusty Creek on a Saturday, 3 weeks after she had left the ranch, and he came into the general store in the afternoon while she was still working and said hello to Jim Priestley, and then stood in the aisle near the dry goods with his hat in his hands in that way he had, and Kate finished what she was doing and came over and said hello. They walked out to the edge of town in the early evening and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, the ranch and the territory, and a book he had been reading about the history of land rights in the American West, which she found genuinely interesting and said so, and he looked pleased in the restrained way of a man who is pleased but trying not to show too much of it. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. On the 4th Saturday he brought her flowers that he had clearly been uncertain about, a bunch of wildflowers from the desert, pale yellow and white, wrapped in cloth, and handed them to her with a self-consciousness that she found so endearing it was almost difficult to manage. They were growing near the eastern pasture creek, he said. She held them and looked at him and decided that she was done pretending not to feel what she felt. "Henry," she said. "Yes. I am not a woman who needs things to be slow for the sake of appearances. I suggested slow because I wanted to be certain, and I am becoming certain." He looked at her with the careful attention of a man who wants to make sure he has heard correctly. "I am also a woman who does not say things she does not mean," she continued. "So when I say that I look forward to Saturdays more than I look forward to anything else in the week, I mean it." Henry was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I leave for home on Sunday mornings, and by Monday I have thought of 12 things I want to tell you." Kate smiled, and it was not a careful smile. It was the real thing, and something changed in his face when he saw it, as if he had been waiting for it without knowing he was waiting. He reached out and took her hand carefully, with the deliberateness of a man who is very aware of what he is doing, and she let him, and they stood at the edge of Dusty Creek with the desert light going golden around them, and the sound of the piano starting up at the saloon and the distant call of something in the scrub brush. And it was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet moment, but it was entirely real. He kissed her for the first time 2 Saturdays after that, on the porch of the boarding house after an evening walk, and it was brief and careful, and then he pulled back and looked at her with a question in his face, and she answered it by putting her hand against his jaw and kissing him again, which was less brief and less careful, and left them both standing in the boarding house lamplight with the kind of stillness that follows something significant. "I have been thinking," he said, when he had recovered himself somewhat, "about asking you to marry me." Kate looked at him steadily. "I have been thinking about it since the hearing," he said. "Since before the hearing, if I'm honest." He paused. "I know we started as a fiction. I know that's an odd beginning." "Every beginning is an odd beginning," Kate said. "Some are just more honest about it than others." He took both her hands in his. His hands were large and calloused and warm, the hands of someone who worked with them, and she thought that there was something very honest about hands like that. "Kate Collins," he said, "will you marry me, truly? Not for a judge or a hearing or a week's arrangement, for real and for always." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had read books alone in the evenings, who had built fence lines and tended cattle, and held on to his father's land through the kind of stubbornness that was actually just love with its jaw set, and she said, "Yes, I will." He exhaled again with that same quality of genuine relief she had heard once before, and she thought she would never tire of being the person who relieved him. They were married in the small church in Dusty Creek 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in late summer when the desert sky was entirely cloudless, and the light was the color of warm gold. Bart Combs was there, looking pleased with himself in the way of a man who knows he had something to do with an outcome. Martha came from the ranch and sat in the front row and cried quietly and did not pretend she was not crying. Jim Priestley was there with his wife. Samuel Turner had ridden 2 days to attend, which Henry was moved by in a way that he was not entirely prepared for. Clara Priestley had sent a letter with her father, who was not present but whose letter said, in the formal and slightly stiff language of a judge writing about personal matters, that he was glad for both of them and hoped they would be very happy, and that his daughter wished to add that she had thought so from the beginning. The minister who performed the ceremony was a man named Reverend Cole, who had baptized and buried and married half the county, and who said the words with the warmth of someone who genuinely believed in what they signified. Henry looked at Kate during the ceremony with an expression she could not fully read and did not need to, because she was looking at him with the same quality of attention, the same something that had been building since the first morning in Bart Combs's office, and that was now simply, yes, this, exactly this. She moved to the ranch in September. The life she found there was harder than anything she had done before, and more satisfying than most things she had done before, and she thought that these two qualities might not be unconnected. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, when to rise, and what needed doing in what order, and how to read the weather from the way the mountains looked in the morning, and which cattle were which, and what the eastern pasture creek level meant for the water supply. She kept the ranch accounts with the same systematic attention she had brought to Jim Priestley's books, and what she found was that the ranch was profitable but not optimally so, and she identified 3 changes to how they managed the summer grazing rotation that she thought would improve the margins. Henry listened to all of this with intense interest and not a trace of condescension, which she had half expected and had prepared herself for and found she did not need. And they argued pleasantly about the grazing rotation over supper for 2 evenings before he agreed she was right, and they implemented it in the spring. Martha watched all of this with the expression of someone whose faith in outcomes has been vindicated, and said occasionally that the house felt like a house again, which was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. In the evenings they read, often in the same room with the lamp burning between them and the Nevada dark outside, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both kinds of evenings were good. Kate wrote to her brothers in Kansas, the first letter she had written in over a year, because there had been nothing to say before, and now there was everything. William wrote back promptly with the formal pleasure of a man who was glad things had worked out for his sister, and also deeply curious about the details. Daniel, who was the funnier of the two, wrote that he was not surprised at all, and that he had always said she would end up somewhere unexpected, and that he hoped Henry knew how lucky he was. Henry read Daniel's letter and said, quietly, that yes, he did know. In the winter of 1882, going into 1883, Kate began to understand that she was going to have a child, and she told Henry one evening after supper when they were sitting by the fireplace, and the snow was coming in sideways outside the windows, and the cattle were in the winter pasture, and everything was very much where it should be. He was still for a moment that was long enough to make her briefly uncertain, and then he put his arms around her, and she felt him breathe in a way that was entirely beyond ordinary speech. And she held on to him, and thought that this was the farthest she had ever been from Missouri, and also in every possible way the most arrived she had ever felt anywhere. Martha, when told the following morning, sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for a full minute, and then said that she had been waiting for the house to sound like this, and that James Easton would have been. And then she stopped, because she was not a woman who cried freely, and she was evidently reaching the limit of her composure, and Kate patted her hand and said she thought so too. Spring came to the Nevada desert with the particular delayed grace that the high desert manages the cold holding on past reason, and then releasing all at once, and then wildflowers along the creek in the eastern pasture, and the cattle moving out into the full grass, and the mountains losing the last of their snow, and the sky going that impossible blue that had no equivalent in any other country Kate had ever seen. On a morning in late April, Henry found Kate standing at the edge of the eastern pasture looking at the creek, and he came and stood beside her, and she was thinking about the fact that this was the land he had almost lost and that everything that followed the wagon trip south, the judge's supper, the hearing, the week in Silver Bend had led here, to this particular morning with the creek running and the cattle moving in the distance. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That this was worth pretending for," she said. He laughed that easy, genuine laugh she had been disarming her with since the celebration dinner, and said, "It turned out not to be pretending." "No," she said. "It turned out not to be." He took her hand and they stood at the edge of the eastern pasture in the April light, and the creek ran on beside them with the quiet permanence of something that would still be there long after everything else changed. Their son was born in July of 1883, on a Thursday morning when the heat was building toward noon, and the sky was the color of hammered copper, and he arrived red-faced and thoroughly opinionated about the event, which Kate said was entirely his father's temperament, and Henry said was entirely his mother's. And Martha, who had served as midwife and support and general source of calm authority through the whole of it, said it was both of them and that the child would probably be a handful and she was looking forward to it. They named him James, for Henry's father. James William Easton, for Henry's father and for Kate's brother, combining the two families in the name in a way that felt complete. Henry held his son for the first time with the same kind of careful deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered deeply, and Kate watched him and thought she had never seen anyone look quite the way Henry Easton looked in that moment, and that she intended to remember it exactly as it was for as long as she lived. Within a few weeks, baby James had entirely reorganized the household in the manner of all small people who arrive with very clear opinions about their own importance, and Martha was besotted in a way she would have denied strenuously but demonstrated constantly. And Henry was the kind of father that Kate had hoped he would be: present, attentive, not afraid to hold an infant or to be seen doing it. Life on the ranch settled into the new shape of itself, which included James, and included the expanding accounting work Kate now did not just for the ranch, but for two neighboring operations whose owners had heard that she was reliable and competent, and had asked if she could look over their books as well, which she did at a fair rate that supplemented the ranch income in a way that was genuinely useful. Gerald Crane, as Tom Webb had predicted, moved his development operations to a different part of the territory and did not return to bother with Silver Bend or Dusty Creek. The legal challenge remained dismissed. The eastern pasture remained Easton land, and the creek ran through it in every season as it always had. Samuel Turner's homestead continued to operate 40 miles west, and he and Henry maintained a friendship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what it meant to work hard for something in country that did not always work with you. Clara Priestley, now 16 and possessed of even more opinions than she had had at 15, wrote to Kate occasionally with questions about accounts and mathematics, having decided on her own that understanding numbers was more useful than the embroidery she was supposed to be learning. And Kate wrote back with thorough and encouraging answers and thought that Clara would be all right. Bart Combs retired from the sheriff's post in the fall of 1883 and was replaced by a younger man, but he remained in Dusty Creek and continued to stop by the general store for coffee and to consider himself responsible for certain outcomes that had unfolded well. On the evening of the first anniversary of their wedding, the same late summer evening quality that their wedding day had had, the same warm gold light, Henry and Kate sat on the front porch of the ranch house with James asleep inside, and the Nevada mountains going pink in the last of the sun, and it was one of those evenings that has no event in it, no occasion beyond itself. "Do you remember what Bart said the morning you came into his office?" Henry asked. "He said you weren't going to ask a woman to pretend to be your wife," Kate said, "and then you volunteered. I was practical about it." He looked at her sideways in the way she had come to know as the look that preceded something he had been thinking about for a while. "I've thought about that a lot, about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that morning, if you had come on a different stage, if Bart had thought to ask you to leave." Kate considered this. "I think you would have found another way." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe Crane would have had the ranch by Christmas and I would be working for someone else's cattle." "And I would be at Jim Priestley's accounts in a boarding house room," Kate said, "which is not a terrible life." "No," he agreed, "but it is a smaller one." She thought about this, about the size of a life, about how the decisions that look smallest often make the most space. She had walked into Bart Combs's office with $72 in a carpet bag, and she had walked out of it with a road trip south and a week's pretense, and a man who held everything he loved with quiet, determined care and the eastern pasture creek running through a bowl of land that was theirs. "Henry," she said. "Yes." "When did you know?" He did not ask what she meant. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly rather than answering quickly. "The dinner at the judge's house," he said, "when you talked about the desert being honest." "And the judge agreed, and you both meant the same thing. I could see that you meant it the same way. And I thought, she sees things truly." Kate turned to look at him. "You?" he asked. She thought about it. "The cottonwood tree," she said. "The first day driving south, when you told me where the spring was hidden that looked dry from the road." She paused. "You gave me that information because it seemed wrong to have it and not share it. That is a way of being in the world that I recognized." He looked at her steadily. "We are very well matched," he said. "We are," she said. He reached across and took her hand in the way he had reached across that first time on the edge of Dusty Creek, with deliberateness, and she held it. And they sat on the porch of the house his father had built, while the light finished its work on the mountains, and the Nevada dark began to come in from the east. Inside, James shifted in his sleep and made a small sound and then was quiet again, and the cattle in the pasture settled for the night, and the creek in the eastern bowl ran on as it had run through seasons of Easton life before them and would run through seasons to come. Kate thought about the morning she had walked into a stranger's office in a town she had never heard of, tired and uncertain, with everything she owned in a bag and a face that showed where she had been. And she thought about how the particular mercy of life was that you could not see from inside a beginning what kind of ending it was growing toward. She had been supposed to pretend to be his wife for 1 week. The week had ended, and neither of them had mentioned it, and neither of them ever did, because what it had become so thoroughly outweighed what it had been that the original arrangement had the quality of a dream useful to have had and irrelevant to hold on to. She was not pretending now. She had never been less pretending in her life. 2 months, she said, out of nowhere. Henry looked at her, questioning. When I agreed to come with you to Silver Bend, she said, I asked for 2 months of the room paid in advance. I had no idea why I asked for 2 months specifically. I think I was buying time for something I didn't know I was waiting for. He laughed, and it was the laugh she had been collecting since the celebration dinner, easy and genuine and entirely real. And did you get it? He said. The thing you were waiting for. She looked at him. This man, this life, this land with its honest sky and its hidden springs and its creek that ran clear through the bowl of the eastern pasture. Yes, Kate Easton said, simply and completely. I did. The stars came out over Nevada, the same extraordinary stars she had stood under in the streets of Silver Bend on the last night of the week that had turned into everything. And the mountains held their shapes against the dark sky. And the house behind them held all the warm evidence of a life that was real and rooted and full. And it went on through seasons and years, and the growth of James, and the additions to the family that came in the years following. A daughter named Ruth in 1885 with her father's eyes, and another son, Daniel, in 1887, named for Kate's brother who traveled out from Kansas to meet him and who stayed 2 weeks and told Henry that he had exceeded all reasonable expectations and that this was the highest praise he gave anyone, and Henry said he would try to maintain the standard. Martha lived to see all 3 grandchildren of the house she had kept for 30 years and died peacefully in the winter of 1889, well into her 70s, in the room she had occupied for as long as anyone could remember, and they buried her on the ranch under a cottonwood tree she had planted herself years before for precisely this purpose, which was entirely characteristic of her. The ranch grew under their combined tending Henry's work and instinct and Kate's numbers and patterns, and the water from the eastern pasture creek watered every year of it. The children grew up knowing the land the way their grandfather had known it, with the particular love that comes from being raised by people who held something dearly and could not help but pass the feeling on. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, and the Nevada dark had come in full, Henry and Kate sat on the front porch in the chairs they had placed there 15 years after the first time they had sat on it together, and they talked or read or were simply quiet, and it was always enough, and it was always real, and it was always theirs. There was a morning, years into it, when James, now taller than his father at 17, with his mother's copper hair and his father's eyes, and a stubbornness that was attributable to both, asked his parents how they had met, having heard various versions over the years and wanting the full account. Kate and Henry looked at each other across the breakfast table with the look of people who share a long and excellent private joke. Your father needed some help, Kate said. Your mother walked into the right office at the right time, Henry said. And the rest, Kate said, was honest. James looked between his parents with the expression of someone who suspects they are not getting the full story, which was entirely accurate, and also not something that mattered in the least, because the full story had resolved itself so completely, and so well that its beginning details were simply the first notes of a long song that was still playing. Out there in the Nevada morning with the mountains in the window, and the creek running in the eastern pasture, and the whole, real, built thing of their life solid around them,